9 times out of 10, gambling is pretty awesome. Sun Tzu. But what happens on that rare occasion when it's not? What if you lost 50,000, 60,000, or even 300,000 gambling? No matter who you are, chances are you've gambled at least once before. It might be on a fart, it might be on acquiring a raunchy skin inside a hero shooter. Yes, I'm looking at you. But maybe, just maybe, one day it might be something that could ruin your life forever. But what happens when the keys to your gambling fix are tucked away inside one of your favourite games, out of the sight and support of friends and family, and instead entrusted to the hands of enablers, scammers, and a company who seemingly just doesn't care? The truth is, RuneScape, much like my own father, has, and likely always will have a problem. A gambling problem. So today we're going to look back across the nearly 25 years of RuneScape's history to understand the origins, changes, and ongoing controversy of gambling inside the game. Along the way, looking at a myriad of unfortunate souls who have fallen victim to the unexpected and once utterly lawless world of RuneScape gambling. We begin in the ancient year of 2001. George Bush becomes the 43rd president of the US, Apple releases the first iPod, and both Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings release their first installment in cinemas, becoming global sensations overnight. Also, another nondescript thing happens which I feel would be too overdramatic to spell out in a RuneScape video.
To answer all my trolls, yes, I do have a bunch of Lego airplanes, but no, I will not be throwing them at my buildings.
But quietly, right at the start of the year, on the 4th of January, RuneScape releases to the public for the very first time. For the first few years of the game, the insidious culture of gambling and scamming hadn't taken root just yet. The infancy of early RuneScape, as well as the simple look that the game had, was reflected in the basic and innocent gameplay. Yes, to clarify, this is actually what RuneScape looked like back in the day. Now, maybe this is no surprise to you, but I genuinely just assumed old school RuneScape's current look had been what it's always looked like. But you learn something new every day. To me, it's kind of a visual reminder of just how old and long-lasting this game is, but I digress. Back then, most players would simply play the game as intended, questing, getting loot, and upgrading their characters. There were only a few thousand players, and so the community felt small and tight-knit. It was all very innocent, as you could probably make out from the footage here. But despite this, the seeds of gambling began to germinate through the addition of one fateful item. And that's not just me being needlessly verbose, I mean they literally began to germinate and grow through the addition of mithril seeds, introduced on the 24th of September 2002. Now I'll explain properly how mithril seeds were used for gambling in just a little bit, but for right now let's look at a much more impactful addition to the game's gambling culture, an area with a now infamous reputation, where many saw themselves skyrocket to untold levels of wealth, while others plummeted into life-ruining debt. And for this, we must look forward a couple of years, all the way to 2004, when, on the 25th of March, Jagex would add the now incredibly divisive Duel Arena, where players could stake. No, not that kind of stake, you silly little munchkin. This type of stake, or rather, staking, which entailed players betting items and gold on the outcome of 1v1 combat duels. Whoever wins the duels wins the items. Pretty simple. But like anywhere where there is profit to be made, eventually the fun would decay and would ferment into something much more sinister, of which the sweet, rotting aroma would attract degenerates and ne'er-do-wells to the game like flies. Now, wait, I know what you're thinking. To clarify, I'm not talking about the individuals unfortunate enough to be swallowed into the unforgiving world of gambling addiction, but rather the kinds of individuals and groups looking to exploit those said individuals. Parties which we will reveal more on later into the video. By this point, there were already quiet murmurings of players becoming hooked on the rush of betting at the arena. Remember though, we're searching deep into the Jedi archives for this one, so while I couldn't find any examples directly from 2002 of players discussing the Duel Arena from forums that existed at the time, due to many of them now being defunct, many modern old-school RuneScape gambling discussions cite the Duel Arena and staking as where they got their first taste of that sweet gambling nectar. In fact, let me pause it there, because there's a direct example I want to touch on to highlight to you guys just how risky the Duel Arena and staking actually was. Now, for this, we're going to have to, as I say, pause for just a second and fast forward all the way to the far future of 2019, a year when popular old school RuneScape streamer Odablock wasn't doing all that great. That is to say, he was 100 billion GP in debt due to poor luck with staking bets. Now that's approximately $300,000 in real money. I know, fucking insane. For some background info, if you're unaware, Odablock has become immensely popular over the years for using the money his donators have contributed to him to generate a much higher return through staking, before then splitting the winnings between himself and the original donator. Oda had become extremely reliable and talented at doing this. However, as is the nature of these things, no one can win 100% of the time, which explains how in 2019, Odablock found himself in such a financial predicament. $300,000 completely gone, a debt that looked only to be getting steeper. But there was one redeeming quality to all of this. Given the nature of how Oda generates a profit, things weren't completely hopeless for him, given the fact that this wasn't actually his money, and was instead money fans had donated to him specifically for him to bet, which, as mentioned, technically meant this wasn't actually Odablock's money, and so if he wanted to, he could have simply left the internet without a trace and ran. But of course, he would leave in his wake a trail of very disappointed fans, who would never end up seeing their money again. So here's the thing, despite Odablock's
what are you doing to me? What are you doing?
unique personality, he would actually show a ton of integrity with his actions. Oda had taken note of every single donator who had given him gold, along with just how much he owed each person, all under the expectation and commitment to pay each and every person back, which in concept seemed laughable. Earning back a 300k debt seemed naive at best. Now, surely there was no way he could ever hope to settle all of this debt to his fans. But despite doubts, over the next 5 months, Oda committed himself to a life of pure commitment and determination, as he streamed himself continuing to stake multiple times a day, gradually winning bets one by one, suffering from nightmares and constant stress along the way. But eventually, somehow against all odds, Oda crawled his way out of the literal hell he was in and emerged completely debt-free. 300k won back, along with the respect and admiration of his community. Crazy. Now, unfortunately, yes, this does validate the 90% of gamblers quit right before they win big memes, but that's not to imply that this situation was at all common. In fact, this was the only example I could find of someone actually succeeding when it comes to gambling. So, Odablock's redemption, whilst extremely noble, may have gone much differently if it wasn't his money on the line, and he represented a more average person, working paycheck to make ends minds meet. And that's why most who get sucked into the gambling vortex aren't as lucky. We'll have a closer look at a couple less fortunate tales later, but all that's important for now is that with the addition of the Duel Arena, events were set in motion that would prove to be the undoing of RuneScape's innocence. Importantly, I want to give you a quick reminder that Oda's story happened all the way in 2019, and with the Duel Arena being added in 2002, that's over 17 years of similar stories happening nearly every day. Sure, most of these tales just resulted in players losing some items and coins, maybe breaking a couple of keyboards, but there wasn't anything too serious. However, there are stories here and there across the internet that speak of much deeper, darker consequences. Stories that I'll get into more towards the end of the video. But good news, on the 29th of March 2004, RuneScape 2 was released, and all player progress was ported over to the new version of the game. RuneScape 2 boasted 3D graphics, changes to combat, and general game mechanics, as well as, of course, an increased player count and world size. Importantly, many now see the beginning of RuneScape 2 as the true beginning of what would become the game's Wild West gambling era. Now, this has been linked to many factors, but mainly the expansion of the game's popularity, booming from only a few thousand in 2001 to approximately 1.5 million registered accounts just by the July of 2004, and supposedly this number was up to 1.9 million by November of 2004. Maybe there's even a case to argue that the rise in popularity of RuneScape was partly due to the allure of the gambling community. What it does prove for sure is just how embedded gambling has been in the RuneScape community all the way since the start. Either way, with an uptick in the number of people gambling, so too was there a rise of scams and exploits, as well as a recognition of the potential that the Duel Arena and Mithril Seeds I mentioned earlier had as methods of winning huge amounts of gold. Now, yes, I know, I still haven't mentioned how the Mithril Seeds actually work, just give me a second. First, I want to touch on the fact that this was all facilitated by expansions to the trading system and a lack of regulation from Jagex, essentially culminating in a Wild West of gambling, and not the cool cowboy sort of Wild West, more of a I can't stop spending all of my real life money and no one is coming to either stop me or save me kind of Wild West. Already, it was easy to pick up on the sense of apathy Jagex had towards gambling in the game. So with that fact established, let's break down what these gambling methods actually entailed. Firstly, as promised, the Mithril Seeds, introduced in 2002. Now, Mithril Seeds could be obtained for gold from the Legends Guild shop of useful items. By using them, they could be planted in the ground by players, after which a few randomly coloured flowers would emerge. This quickly led to what become known as the flower game, where players would bet on what colour of flower would emerge from the seeds. As you can see here, colours would emerge in combinations of 3, essentially allowing players to play blackjack with them. Just awesome. Next we have the Dice Bag, added to the game on the 15th of July 2009. This was available from Farouk's Tools for Games. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Farouk. This was available from Farouk's Tools for Games shop in Al Kharid, and it was utilised by players to play the creatively named dice game. When used, they would generate a random number, and you can probably already see where this is going. Typical practice was to bet if the number would land higher or lower than 55. Now, bearing in mind the range was from 1 to 100, this only gave a 45% chance of winning. For an even higher jackpot, some players would risk betting on a specific number. As expected, this led to a lot of losses, but when guessed correctly, the payout could be phenomenal. As a result of the growing popularity of the dice game, hosts began to spam chat with adverts, in certain cases even employing the use of bots to spam said adverts in chat, much to the very understandable annoyance of regular players. But the fun didn't end there. No, we're just beginning. Additionally, there were a range of lesser used chance-based items. First, the toy horsey, which would say one of 3 lines: "Come on Dobbin, we can win the race," "Hi-ho silver and away," and "Nay, giddy up horsey." Now, as far as gambling methods go, I've got to say this one is my favourite. Just look at that little guy. But there's also the Easter ring, which would change players into a plethora of Easter egg colours. Blah blah blah, you get the gist. Lots of random chance items equals lots of gambling. Now, unfortunately, it's nearly impossible to trace back and determine whether these items were specifically added to facilitate gambling, or if they were just added for fun. But the dice bag and jewel arena, that's a bit more of a stretch. Regardless, staking in the jewel arena was still incredibly popular. The area was constantly full of players flooding in for their daily fix of staking. But the important thing is that Jagex, for all intents and purposes, now had a virtual casino on their hands. But in fairness, the profits weren't going to Jagex themselves, at least not all of it. Instead, a lot was actually going to the players. But how exactly? After all, it's not like old school RuneScape was like GTA Online, where you can cash out in-game cash for real life money. Or was it? By around 2006, gambling in RuneScape had well and truly become a widespread phenomenon, but things really began to change in 2007. Apple is once again making big moves by releasing the first iPhone, Halo 3 is released, a game I still adore and sometimes play to this day, social media like Facebook and Twitter are starting to gain huge popularity, and most ironically of all, the US subprime mortgage crisis begins to mount, leading to the 2008 financial crisis. In layman's terms, there's never been a better time to gamble. Despite the financial hardship over in the real world, making profit in RuneScape had never been easier, as just a few months prior, in November of 2007, Jagex added the Grand Exchange to the game, a way to buy and sell items in bulk. This revolutionized trading. No longer would players have to stand and spam adverts in places like Varrock West Bank or Falador Park, looking for other players to trade with like some kind of peasant. Instead, they can more or less liquidate their items won from gambling in an instant by trading them for gold. But this quickly led to the rise of 2 very major problems: botting and real-world trading. Now, chances are if you've played RuneScape, you'll already be well aware of what these terms mean. But assuming you're not, both are quite self-explanatory. Botting refers to the act of purchasing bots to play the game for you, typically to gather resources and sell them for gold at the Grand Exchange. Similarly, eventually bots could even be used to gamble or even scam other players. Either way, whatever it was they were doing, these bots would work tirelessly to earn their owners money, like some kind of thralls or medieval peasants. And believe me, they made an absolute shit ton of gold, which leads into the second big issue I mentioned. Okay, so what do you do when you have billions of gold in RuneScape, but you're broke in real life? Well, you get into real world trading. As you'd expect, this term refers to selling in-game gold and other resources like fucking lobsters, sharks, willow logs, or dragon bones in exchange for real world money. Cold, hard cash. Now, real-world trading was nothing new or novel. It had existed since the inception of RuneScape all the way in 2001, but that wasn't the real problem. The actual problem lay within the fact that features like the Grand Exchange meant it was increasingly viable to make a great deal of real, cold, hard cash from the game in a very short window of time. And once again, wherever there is profit to be made, degenerates swarm to like flies. But surprisingly, and very fortunately, this didn't actually really impact the game much. At least not if you don't consider areas being full of bots, the chat being spammed with gambling and trade adverts, and an economy increasingly harmed by the growing popularity of gambling to be classified as impacting the game. Most players, as expected, were very pissed. These chat advert bots cost hundreds of dollars a month to run, but would bring in tons more. As Kemp Q shows in his video on RuneScape gambling, muting these players wasn't even a permanent way to keep them from flooding the chat with advertisements, as just a few hours later they would be inexplicably unmuted. The ludicrous amounts of money players could generate from gambling undermined the more legitimate ways of making money, such as questing, skilling, or monster hunting, and naturally players felt this was unfair as they worked very hard for their money. Of course, it wasn't the most lucrative way of earning cash, but in old school RuneScape culture, beating a dragon to death and stealing his pension fund is considered a hard, wholesome, and honest day of work. And all these bots were doing was coming in and cocking it up for the average player. Even if you wanted to play the game legitimately, there was still a small, nagging voice at the back of your head telling you that you could be earning 10, 100, or even 1,000 times more gold if you would just stake in the arena. On top of this, there's the fact that real-world trading is against Jagex's rules, truly making traders and botters the most oppressed minority in gaming. And that's not even mentioning the fact that these bots are all completely illegal in real life. And fun fact, most bots had their memberships purchased using stolen credit cards, leading to fraudulent transactions, chargebacks, and eventually major credit card companies cutting ties with Jagex, almost resulting in the closure of Jagex and subsequent shutting down of RuneScape. Now, you're not going to believe this, but there was also a court case with Jagex appearing before UK Parliament to discuss gambling and the addictive nature of the game. Not only did Jagex deny the addictive nature of the game, but they denied that the Duel Arena constitutes as gambling. Why? Well, because the Duel Arena takes skill, not just random chance. Good one, Jagex. Very crafty. But largely that's a story for another time. The point is that Jagex had to do something soon, or else they would risk going bankrupt. And so Jagex cracked down on bans for accounts found to be using bots or engaging in real-world trading, but lacked the resources and cash to properly tackle these issues head-on. The only option Jagex had left was to take some much more drastic measures. With mounting pressure from both players and credit card companies, on the 2nd of January 2008, just over a month after the Grand Exchange was added, Jagex made the call. They would introduce severe sanctions to gambling aimed at culling real-world trading. Of course, Jagex must have known this would piss off a lot of legitimate players, but it didn't matter. They needed real-world trading gone at any cost. So they made some changes, starting with the infamous trade limit, a brand new system which would cap the value of a trade so that players could no longer trade large sums to each other. Instead, the amount they could trade was determined by how many quest points a user had. Now, if you don't know, quest points are given to players upon completion of quests. Essentially, the more of the game you had played, the more you were allowed to trade. So let's say you've only done one quest and have 50 or less quest points. Well, enjoy being capped at 300 gold pieces for any trade you do. LOL! Whereas if you've done a bazillion quests and have killed a ton of dragons or some shit and had 200 plus quest points, fuck it. Have a 30,000 GP trade limit. Well, why not? Well, what about a 31,000 gold piece trade limit? Well, now you're just taking the piss. But even at 30k, it was certainly a far cry to the several million or even billion which high rollers had been exchanging. Not only this, but Jagex also removed PKing for profit in the wilderness and staking at the Duel Arena. While it is true that this made it a lot harder for players to bot and real-world trade, there were some major impacts, including, but not limited to, making gift giving near impossible, so that players could no longer help new players or share items with friends, making merchanting more or less impossible as flipping items at the Grand Exchange was no longer viable, and removing the fun from PKing and staking at the Jewel Arena. So, of course, this was all met with a ton of dismay from the community. As you can see here, players took to the streets to protest, saying stuff like, "We pay to PK," and "No wild equals game over." Jagex was definitely in trouble. As for other gambling methods, like the dice bag and flower game, well, they were pretty much made redundant too, as players wanted to make huge, risky bets with millions, or as I said, even billions of gold, and all they had left was basically the equivalent of like, I don't know, a peanut and a couple of dusty old pennies, which they had found at the bottom of their wallets. Like, you know, it's still possible, just not very fun. To give a more succinct explanation, essentially Jagex had made it almost impossible for real-world trading to occur, which is pretty good, but this came at the expense and enjoyment of pretty much the whole player base. However, there were a select few for whom these changes were a literal godsend. It's important to remember that the people trading for real-world currency weren't just people making a ton of profit, there were also much more realistic examples. Players such as Reddit user Staking Recovery, who details the $60,000 impact that the Jewel Arena had on his life, essentially pinning the blame on RuneScape's unchecked culture for this drastic loss. And there were way more similar users to Staking Recovery. Players like this definitely represent a small minority of the game's user base, but for them the problems ran incredibly, life-ruiningly deep. Without sounding overdramatic, these people were literally cast out to sea without any kind of rescue, all to keep the cogs of RuneScape turning. However, while these more seriously addicted players breathed a sigh of relief, other more typical players were massively hindered from enjoying the game. It's insane too, because the trade limits had made merchanting, which was a completely legitimate and legal way of making money within the game, about as useful as a condom machine within a monastery. Unsurprisingly, this led to the sentiment that RuneScape was ruined, an attitude that would continue to propagate and escalate in the years following. By the end of 2010, Jagex could no longer withstand the persistence of the community, and so on the 21st of December 2010, they held a vote. Would you like to see the wilderness and free trade reintroduced back into the game? 24 hours pass, and over 1.2 million votes had been added. A staggering 91% said yes. 91%. The poll was so decisive that it even closed early on the 24th of December with 1.7 million votes. After all, the risk of scams and gambling was what drew so many players to the game in the first place, and so many were in eager anticipation to re-experience the excitement which they had been deprived of for a few tough years. And so, on the 1st of February 2011, Jagex yielded and reintroduced free trade and the wilderness. Enter a new golden age for old school RuneScape. Both veterans and new players rush back to the game to enjoy a gambling renaissance no one had seen coming. The streets of settlements like Falador, Brimhaven and Draenor Village flooded with players financially ruining themselves for a cheap rush once more. As for the wilderness, well, that was once again alive with players PKing and losing their items. The game had found a new breath of life, facilitated by all new gambling clans to act as middlemen in bets, as well as the attention of online creators who began showcasing their gambling success. However, the newfound glory RuneScape and its community had been basking in wasn't to last. Jagex and the community had been so obsessed with saving the game that they couldn't see the destruction waiting for them just a few steps down the road. With gambling once again viable, so was real-world trading. Bots and scammers flooded back into the game. Now, if you know anything about RuneScape, you'll know the community is extremely resistant to any bullshit. A phenomenon illustrated no better than by the response to the reappearance of bots in the game. In 2017, in a supposedly leaked email from Jagex to their shareholders, they refer back to this point in 2011, where the bot incursion is described as increasing to epidemic proportions, with players rallying to boycott buying memberships as a result. Jagex made no secret of their concern, openly appealing to the player base through transparency, making it clear that they were hard at work developing new programs to counter the botting crisis. For Jagex, this was bad enough alone, but contributed to an already alarming problem. The abrupt influx of new players using the Grand Exchange to trade items saw the market flooded with items, leading to a huge dip in the prices of nearly every item in the game, with some items even losing as much as 50% of their value. It was like 2015's The Big Short, but in RuneScape, in a sense. If this wasn't bad enough, clans like Dragon Dice soon monopolised gambling, making billions of GP daily. The spam from these clans littered the chat, and prices continued to throttle down. Fan forums and sites were flooded with complaints about not being able to buy and sell due to the chat being saturated with autotypers. And so before anyone had a chance to actually enjoy the brief gambling renaissance, RuneScape was once again in tatters. Jagex was panicking. They needed a solution fast, so they said fuck off Dicebag and removed it from the game in November of the same year, naively thinking it would magically fix all of the gambling issues. Needless to say, it did not. It was a plan that might have thwarted the efforts of real-world traders and gambling clans, had it not been for the fact that many other gambling methods still existed inside the game. Methods like the flower game, for example. With this considered, Jagex's choice to remove the dice bag was more just confusing than anything. "Oh rats," said Jagex, and then they sat around brainstorming a solution for nearly 2 years. Yes, 2 whole years. Now I've got a note here in my script reminding me to add a segment about the evolution of combat update, which is a whole other barrel of fish. If this is something you want to know about, just look up RuneScape's EOC update. But essentially all you need to know is that Jagex were pretty preoccupied with that at the time, so their delaying made sense. But eventually, by the time 2013 arrived, they had the answer. In a developer update on the 18th of March titled Dealing with Games of Chance, Jagex announced that they would soon be removing the flower game's potential as a betting method by making it so mithril seeds would always sprout white flowers, and would only show a random colour once picked up and added to a user's inventory. In their announcement of the update, they detailed progress on dealing with botting and gold farming, as well as clarifying that engaging in games of chance is completely against the rules. Similarly, no more randomness for the Ring of Egg, as it had now been changed to always turn players into a blue egg. The seal of approval emote was changed to always show the same seal, and most tragically of all, the toy horsey had the full 1984 I have no mouth and I must scream treatment by getting rid of the 3 phrases it could say and instead replacing it with just say nay to gambling, which I suppose is good, but the soul, the heart, just wasn't there anymore. Finally, the classic cape was also changed, preventing it from being used for games of chance. But still, real-world trading and bots hadn't been vanquished. With all the other gambling methods removed, all that was left now was the dueling arena. However, the arena came with its own host of issues. Despite being officially moderated by Jagex, scammers once again more or less ran the show. It was common to find nefarious players trolling and taunting other players into fighting them by trash talking them until they took the bait, at which point they would use exploits or cheap tactics to win fights. And this is crazy, some even resorted to knocking their opponent's internet connection offline while they were PKing. Unsurprisingly, all of these methods were very effective, and so because of that, chances are you can already tell where this is going. If you guessed that Jagex were going to step in and make changes to the duel arena, PKing and staking, you would be correct. 2014 rolled around. People all over the world were doing the fucking ice bucket challenge, and over at Jagex, a couple of employees decided, hey, we should probably do something about the duel arena, and made the decision to try a slightly different approach this time. Instead of removing the arena or setting a trade limit, they decided they would try and decrease the popularity of the duel arena by instead incentivizing PKing in the wilderness, which wasn't quite as bad of a gambling method as the duel arena. Since wilderness PvP revolved more around skill and preparation rather than simple chance and exploits, it meant that players would actually have to play the game fairly instead of gambling. God, please no. To achieve this, they added the Wilderness Bag, which players could use to store additional loot they had taken from their defeated enemies in the wilderness, or protect some items they didn't want stolen. Ironically, this actually increased the risk in the wilderness, but in a much more fair and moderated way. This was admittedly one of Jagex's much more smarter moves, and so was met with some positive reaction from the community, but certainly also had its fair share of frustrated players, who believed that these changes were made as a further attempt to reduce risk and control the economy, essentially sucking yet more fun and excitement out of the game. Now, as much as I love to lie and spread misinformation, I'll be crystal clear here. Jagex was put in a pretty difficult spot. As valid as all the complaints of the frustrated players were, there were just as many who were begging for changes to the duel arena. As much as it sounds like I'm slandering Jagex throughout this video, it needs to be stated that these were very clearly just passionate devs trying their hardest to balance the demand of multiple subsets of the player base, along with demands of their bosses and upper management, so they had a pretty difficult choice to make. Similarly, a lot of players, even those running low-level scams, were mostly just normal people hooked by a very sinister addiction. So, to try and appease as many people as possible, following the major change of the looting bag, a succession of minor tweaks and adjustments were made to balance the fun and fairness in the wilderness. Primarily the wilderness updates. Following this point, they centered around reducing real-world trade by limiting rewards for PKing so that it was less viable as a means for collecting massive amounts of gold. However, it was still kept somewhat profitable, just enough to be fun for legitimate players, but not quite enough for real-world traders to turn a quick profit off. However, for many players, nothing could shake the notion of the game feeling increasingly neutered and less exciting. The game was on life support. It got so bad that old school RuneScape sank to as low as only 7,000 daily players on average in 2014. For context, the game had approximately 50,000 daily players throughout 2013. It's over. One wrong change, a single misguided update, and the game could risk being extinguished forever. Now, I knew a lot of players liked gambling, but Jesus, almost a 93k drop. It's fucking over. It seemed Jagex were really gambling with their cash cow. And with that, some of the more dedicated gambling clans put their foot down, decided to take matters into their own hands. The RuneScape community would have their gambling, whether Jagex liked it or not. The plan was simple. Since Jagex kept flip-flopping and would repeatedly take gambling out of the game, a few community members said, okay, we'll keep it out of the game. Jagex, of course, retorted, what what you guys mean by that. But the clans just laughed menacingly and faded into the shadows. But what did this mean exactly? Well, more weeks passed, and all was quiet on the gambling front inside of the official game. But throughout forums and in-game chats, rumours of old-school RuneScape gambling sites began to circulate. It's like that, you know, it's like the Bender quote from Futurama. You know the one.
I'm gonna go build my own casino with blackjack and hookers.
Sites like RuneBet, RuneStake, and Rune Hall began to stir from the shadows and gained almost immediate traction. Weirdly, it seems there was more backlash against Jagex for their poor handling of gambling in the game, rather than there was outrage at the sites themselves for existing. I suppose many saw it as a natural evolution of Jagex's choice to prohibit gambling inside of the game. But this was still surprising, considering these sites were a complete and utter cesspit. They were essentially just normal gambling sites, with games such as coin flip and roulette. However, considering the context, they harboured a much more sinister side. Many players were just young children when they started gambling inside the official RuneScape game, and had passed through the gateway of addiction, now utterly hooked and constantly looking for a gambling fix. However, now they were no longer under the somewhat apathetic but still present supervision of Jagex, but instead firmly in the hands of the exploitative gambling site owners. The most upsetting element of all of this is that for most of the old school RuneScape gambling community, all they had to help them overcome their addictions were each other. Whenever you get the mood to stake or gamble, just think of an empty cash stack. That's enough motivation for me. Truly some very sad stuff. Despite all the money being lost and all the players helplessly addicted, it really seemed that Jagex didn't care. In a video by Crumb called Inside a Lucrative Betting Website, he interviews a co-owner of a large gambling site who states that Jagex's attitudes towards these sites was that they were out of sight, out of mind. Now, take this, of course, with a pinch of salt, as this is just likely the opinion of one very biased site owner. However, it does seem to be largely confirmed by Jagex's seeming sense of apathy towards sites at the time. Once again, to emphasize, many of these players who had fallen into the gambling trap were just children. Children who were, by 2016, having these sites constantly shoved in their faces by Twitch and YouTube creators. Each day that ticked by made it harder and harder for Jagex to simply ignore the problem, as their popularity and profits skyrocketed. In Crumb's video, he even calculates that these sites may have even been making millions of pounds of profit a year. Just fuck. Legal threats, reputation damage, and mounting pressure from government regulators piled into pressure against Jagex on all sides. And with that, finally, Jagex was forced to do something. And so they did as they should have done from the very beginning, by taking legal actions against betting sites, and working with platforms like Twitch and YouTube to cease promotion of them. And to top it off with a cherry on the cake, a mass ban wave for accounts found to be botting or engaging in real-world trading. And so by 2017, most forms of gambling to do with RuneScape had been banned, with remaining options severely crippled in comparison to what they once were. And generally, real-world trading was not nearly as viable as it once was. And so, at least here in Britain, children and adults alike closed down RuneScape, took off their headsets, got up off their chairs and marched out into the streets and flooded into the nearest Betfreds and Mecca bingos. Of course, the player numbers were down, but ultimately the day had been saved. And so, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Well, not entirely. 2017 also marked a year of further changes. Jagex removed high-risk staking, making it so you can only stake cash, and will also be taxed 1% on stakes over 100 million. This probably pissed off a lot of risk fighters, but it seemed Jagex wasn't going to budge this time. And since then, there have been similar tweaks and balances to gambling and RuneScape as a whole ever since, but I'll be honest, from around 2017, things have kind of mellowed out. With less ways to gamble and a subsequent reduction in the amount of botting and real-world trade accounts, things have more or less fell into an equilibrium as much as they really can. You've probably noticed by this point in the video that the cycle goes: Jagex makes it hard for players to use a certain gambling method, the community gets creative and finds an innovative and fun way around it, Jagex overcorrects and makes the game less fun, the community is outraged, then Jagex brings back the original gambling method, etc, etc. It's a process that reminds me of a certain quote.
Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Doing the exact same fucking thing over and over again, expecting shit to change.
It's hard to say if things will ever really change, and if they do, to what side. And with the choice being essentially facilitating and enabling a criminal gambling underworld and losing all of your player base, I can see why it's a difficult choice to make. The point is that RuneScape's community, for better or worse, thrives on the high-risk excitement of gambling. But as the game continues to evolve, Jagex is locked in an ongoing, multiple decades spanning war of attrition against scammers, gambling, and real-world traders. And that's more or less how it's carried on. So to wrap up, I'll give you a quick, sexless, dispassionate, and rushed rundown of the key events from 2017 onwards. Okay, so 2022. Jagex claims that the dueling arena is unacceptable and removes it entirely from the game, replacing it instead with Emir's Arena, an arena which allows players to duel using preset loadouts in a controlled environment where fights are fairer and more evenly matched. This choice has pushed gambling underground, and so illegal gambling rings are beginning to resurface, unsurprisingly much to the dismay of the community, who claim that the removal of the duel arena has only made gambling even more unsafe due to the reappearance of said gambling rings. And not too long ago, at 12 noon UTC on the 15th of August 2024, deathmatching was prohibited, with penalties including 3-day bans, wealth removal, and permabans for repeat offenders. But somehow gambling is still alive and kicking, albeit as a shambling husk of what it once was. The point is that for many players, these changes and the myriad of others that litter the history of RuneScape's gambling scene simply weren't enough. But what do I mean by that? Well, I want to round the video off with a final poignant recount I found while researching this video. Something which I think best reflects the lack of foresight Jagex had when it came to the consequences of gambling. 4 years ago, Day One Life would make a post on the r/2007scape subreddit, a community for old school RuneScape discussion. In this post, Day One would share how his life has been impacted by the rampant gambling in the game. He first entered RuneScape around age 8 in 2007, enamored by a virtual world full of skills, quests, and monsters. But sadly, this innocent enjoyment of the game would be corrupted when they fell for a couple of scams. The notions of shame, embarrassment, and loss would send Day One down a dark path. In a very desperate attempt to regain his wealth, he used his parents' credit card to buy more gold. But as his gambling luck ran out, he was quickly down 500, then 5,000, then 10,000. Day One describes how he was plagued by constant nightmares over the following 14 years, as his debt mounted ever higher, completely out of his debt and unable to pay a penny of it back. Despite interventions from his parents, breaks from the game, and constant losses, in 2021, Day One accepted his grief and decided it was time to put RuneScape and his gambling addiction behind him. Over these 14 years, Day One has racked up approximately $50,000 in debt. Now, of course, this isn't as crazy as the $300k debt we've seen, but it's the way it affected Day One's life which really counts. Despite this, interestingly, they bear no hard feelings towards Jagex or the community and have started attending therapy to help loosen the hold addiction has on them. Day One answered a few questions in the thread, but aside from that, they haven't been active on this account since making the first initial post. I tried reaching out, but heard nothing back. So, Day One, wherever you are out there, I hope you're doing well and have been able to make progress in your addiction. So, where does that leave us today? Well, at this point, gambling is seemingly integral to old school RuneScape, and to remove it may also mean pulling the plug on RuneScape itself. Whether Jagex likes it or not, RuneScape, much like real life, just doesn't seem to have that magic without the risk and excitement of gambling. Old school RuneScape exists today with a vast history of victims in its wake, showcasing the effect of gambling in a largely unmoderated Wild West era of the internet. While there's much more control and restriction placed on it these days, unfortunately a lot of the damage has been done. Of course, one of the main questions I've tried to reiterate throughout this video is if Jagex should have done more to stop this. I mean, legally, RuneScape has never officially been recognized as an online casino, so they're kind of off the hook in that regard. But from a moral standpoint, well, there it gets a bit murkier. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go hit the slots.